All right. So, Steve Wolf, let's maybe start with some intros to get this going. I'll start with myself. So this whole discussion about multiculturalism. I'm a Iranian American myself, and I'm a creator, and I also work at #Paid. But on the creator side, really my mission is to bring our culture forward to Americans, so they know more about Persians and how my mom talks to me, her accent, etc. And so it's all very exciting for me, and I'm super pumped to have this chat. I'll pass it on to you.
My name's Steve Wolf. I have the privilege of leading a significant portion of the Bud Light portfolio for Anheuser Busch InBev. I live here in Denver, Colorado, so it's a fantastic opportunity to get to spend time with all of you guys. I know some of you out of town, but many of you local marketers here in Colorado.
He flew in from Texas like 2 hours ago. He's like, I'm like, what are we talking about? He's like, let's just wing it. I'm like, all right, let's go. So let's start high level. Obviously Bud Light, little side flex, is the largest beer brand in the US of A. And so I'm sure you've learned a lot along the way. Steve's been there for about 7 years, recently appointed VP of marketing of Bud Light extensions in specific. So I think I'd be curious to know, what has the brand learned over the past 40 years that'll bring it success, in the next 40 years?
It's a good question. So Bud Light was launched in 1982, right? And it was late to the light beer game. So Miller Lite was the first player. We lagged for a bit. It took us about 4 years to rise to become the #1 beer in America. And if you think about the marketing landscape in 1986, it looked a lot different than it does today, right? The number of channels in which you needed to speak to consumers was pretty limited. The number of options that consumers had when they thought about what they wanted when they went to the bar, or what they wanted when they went to the packaged liquor or grocery store, was quite limited. So we're seeing a tremendous amount of fragmentation these days. And so the way we communicate with consumers, the way we're able to speak in a way that will allow us to retain that size and that level of brand power needs to fundamentally change.
I mean, how has that changed?
Sure. So a few ways, right? We can think about product, and then we can think about channel, right? So product. So again, 1986, we hit the peak, right? Where we all of a sudden overtake as the largest beer brand in America. And that lasted for a long time, right? In terms of continuing to grow, continue to exert dominance. But as we get into the 2000s, we start to see share decline a bit, right? We see more players come in. And so we needed to become creative. We needed to find ways of, maybe it's not one particular liquid that appeals to all consumers. Maybe we need to use innovation to be able to talk to a wider subset, right? And this is really where my role comes in. So I lead the Bud Light extensions portfolio. So when we think about innovating off of the mother brand being about a 12 share of the market, how do we start to think about finding new product propositions that appeal to different demographics, right? How do we make sure we've got the right product at the right price in the right market for the right consumer across the board? And so that started with playing with incorporating fruit peels into an offering. Bud Light Lime, many of you guys have had. That expanded into a product called Bud Light Chelada, which is a Hispanic-focused play. Started really integrating Clamato, so a tomato-based drink, into beer that has been incredibly popular. And then
micheladas.
Michelada is a play, right? Michelada means my mix, literally, and Michelada is a base of that, right? And then most recently, we launched a product in January called Bud Light Next, which was a sort of a recognition that we needed a new product to speak to Gen Z, right? To 21 to 27. A lot of the benefits that consumers liked around drinking seltzers, which is you feel really light, you don't feel bloated. We wanted to bring that to a beer product, right? And we're able to, after about 10 to 15 years of R&D, launch our first zero carb offering that was able to do just that.
And by the way, it's 80 calories a can. So you can have like 10 of those and you're still under the caloric deficit.
My legal team would not allow me to say that. So I did not say
I'm not your legal team. It's okay. Although I'm not in the Gen Z category, I'm 32, bright millennial.
You look great for 32.
Thank you so much. It's the beard, men's makeup. I'd be curious to know, in terms of, and I know we were talking about this before, for catering to that sort of younger legal drinking age demographic, you had to test out new things. There's other channels to be on. I mean, Gen Z, TikTok speaks to me, but that's obviously not a channel we can be on. based on the legal drinking age, et cetera. So I'm curious to know what your approach was to marketing when it came to Next in specific, catering to that younger demographic, what worked, what didn't work.
Sure. So I think the marketing channel, let's table that for 1 second. I think one product, obviously, we'd be remiss if we didn't spend a little bit of time talking about is recognizing the seltzer trend in America, right? So seltzer launched 3 to 4 years ago, and it came like a wave, right? It absolutely flooded and became really, really, really big, really fast. And so we launched an offering called Bud Light Seltzer to attend to that trend. And what we recognized is the power of the Bud Light name would allow us to get wide distribution very quickly. It would come with some challenges that we needed to face over time, but we knew that would give us a really strong foundation to be able to fight from, right? Next kind of played after that, recognizing that trend and then figuring out how do we modify our marketing message to be able to compete in this space where we had no presence until fairly late into the game.
Okay. If we're talking about a Bud Light Seltzer, I want to do a little social experiment. First of all, who knows Bud Light Seltzer? Put your hands up. Wow, look at that market penetration. And how many of you believe, if it's a yes, put your hands up, that Bud Light Seltzer has beer in it? Put your hands up.
Don't be shy. It's okay. We'll talk about this in just a moment.
Interesting. So very sophisticated crowd, of course.
They're very educated. It's Colorado, so we know our alcohol here in Colorado, which is great.
So I think that the reason I did that experiment was to lead to the question of what the challenge has been with Bud Light Seltzer, especially, in a market where me as a millennial, when I think seltzer, I think White Claw. I think Truly, for example. So I'd love to chat about that and sort of the differentiation there, where you see the problem, where you see a potential opportunity. We talked about it a bit, and sort of tying it into the inclusivity piece as well in terms of sort of how White Claw is currently branded.
Totally. So good question. And again, don't be shy. We're gonna ask probably a few questions in here, and feel free to give your honest assessment. So my biggest challenge, right? We kind of alluded to the benefits of launching with the Bud Light name and extension, where all of a sudden you have broad reach, you have great distribution. The flip side of that, the challenge is 54% of consumers believe that Bud Light Seltzer contains beer, right? And if you think about a lot of the reasons why people drink seltzers is because they want a beer alternative. So it's a huge barrier to trial. So we spent a lot of time. I came to this role in May. We did a huge deep dive to think about, we're number 3 in the total category right now. What are the barriers? How do we think about where the growth opportunities are against the number 1 to 2 players? And what we found is it's really like a tale of 2 cities. So consumers who have tried us rate us really well. Our repeat rate is super strong. But people who have not tried us assume, largely based on the beer barrier, assume on all the metrics that drive trial, we rate really, really low, right? And so my biggest barrier is, how do I attack that perception that there's actually physically beer in this product? And so, again, this is a big, hairy problem. We call it like a furry monkey in our business, right? Which is like, it's kind of meaty. It's not really that easy to wrap your hands around. How do you figure it out? Where I see the opportunity is, again, it kind of plays back to that idea of the strength of the Bud Light name. So my household penetration in the US on Bud Light Seltzer is sitting about 5%. The category leader in the seltzer category is about 12%. When you think about Bud Light as a product, we're sitting somewhere between 30 and 40%. So massive upside, right? And you also think, because the seltzer trend grew so fast, so quickly, the market leader is a product that is that's highly identified to 25-year-old white women. It's not that. That's sort of like the way that they've landed. We believe the widespread approachability of the Bud Light name has the potential, if seeded well, to be able to steal more than our fair share. So while the category as a whole has definitely slowed down, right? It's not the exponential growth it was before. It's about flat to slightly down this year. We believe the chance to steal greater shares is here for our taking, based on the approachability and the accessibility of what has made Bud Light famous over these last 40 years.
So I'm guilty of drinking White Claws. But I guess on that topic, how do you stand out in this crowded landscape? How do you cater to that perhaps not white female demographic through your marketing strategies?
It's a good question. It's obviously something we're still really wrestling with. And I think the number one thing we need to do is attack this barrier, right, which we talked about. And the way to do that's going to be a multi-pronged approach. And something we're spending a lot of time thinking about is, how do we leverage creators to be able to do that? And so just kind of taking a step back, I started my career as a global marketer. I launched Budweiser in about 30 countries around the world. And then I stepped away and went to sales for 4 or 5 years to lead our sales team, most recently in Colorado. And I think the evolution of where the influencer space sat in 2018 when I left versus where we are now is actually quite material. The relationship on influencers in 2018 was largely transactional, right? It's you hire them to basically take pictures holding your can or holding your product. And one of the areas that we're really interested in is how do we use creators to democratize our storytelling to attack these barriers, right? And we've got a couple of them on each of these brands. I'm sure any brand marketer has their barriers. How do we democratize this approach to be able to very authentically speak to our audience? And one of the things we wrestle with most, and especially where most of the growth is coming from in seltzer, in the category where Next plays, is Gen Z is a very difficult consumer group to speak to. It's super fragmented. Again, we talk about media channel fragmenting. Live TV is still relevant for us, just mostly around sports, but way less prevalent than it used to be. So we need to find new partners and new channels to be able to do just that. And honestly, we'd love to hear your thoughts a little bit on like, how are you seeing that space evolve? You've been on this journey for 4 or 5 years. Where is that going?
Yeah, I mean, I'll use myself as a creator, not the hashtag paid hat on for a second. So I worked with a brand called ViewSonic, and they had a brief that they wanted, content in a certain way, but they were pretty open. And my pitch was, why don't I do like a Persian skit of my dad buying a new monitor? It was very comedic. And she was totally okay with it. So we're sort of pushing the envelope in terms of being inclusive and catering to a new demographic, because I could speak that language. I could do the Persian accent perfectly, and my Persian audience or Persian American audience will get it. And so will anyone who knows Persians. And so that was very successful. The numbers were successful. And I think, relating it to more of a broader picture, and generally, I think I'll use Sephora. I think beauty brands are generally pretty good with being inclusive across LGBTQIA communities, and so on and so forth. And so with Sephora, they ran 2 campaigns. One was for Diwali and one was for Chinese Lunar New Year. And they worked with creators that were obviously in those communities. And so it was very apparent when you see the outcome of that content. They know how to speak that language. They know the nuances that we've been talking about all day, to make sure that there's a authentic, one, it's an authentic collaboration because they already use Sephora products, but 2, that Sephora is, put beside this initiative, say Diwali, as a celebration authentically, because they're using folks that are actually in that community versus hiring an actress and a photographer, videographer to try to tell that story. So I do think like creators in general, what we like to say, they're like at the forefront of culture, and they speak those languages, in the most authentic way. And so the challenge typically is, how do you find and source the right creators that can, one, be authentic to your brand so that they actually drink Bud Light seltzer, or they're open to it, and also sort of leaving it open for them to come up with their creative concepts as well.
That makes a ton of sense. And honestly, it's just a topic I find to be really fascinating based on where we are in our brand journey. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on, evolving from thinking about influencers or creators as like transactional creators, right? So solving a specific content need or a specific brand barrier challenge, to really sort of brand ambassadors that live your life for a longer period of time, or live sort of the ideals of the brand for a longer period of time. Are you seeing brands trend one way or the other? Is it much more still sort of challenge focused, or is it more so embedding for longer durations to land those messaging?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if Chrissy is still here. We talked about VitaFusion and like Kim Kardashian doing gummy bears for losing weight. So that to me is like a perfect example of an influencer versus a creator. And so I'd say I think more brands in general are using the term creator just to start off with versus influencer, which shows there's a deeper understanding of what that differentiation is. The way I look at it is as a creator, you might do this for a living. This is your craft. You don't create content and delete it the next day because you're working with a competitor. You keep it up because you're proud of it. You might reject campaigns because it doesn't fit with your brand ethos. And so those are the kinds of things I would look for in terms of differentiating between a transactional influencer versus a creator. And I'd say, to answer your question on like one-time posts versus long-term ambassadors, definitely we're going in the direction of more long-term. What we're thinking, I mean, we work with Infinity, for example. Alan Pounder is one of our creators. For one of their recent assets, they got cinema rights to use that content across cinemas in North America. And so to me, that's just a clear indication as to where content creation is going towards, and the fact that it's likely going to be very creator-led versus, commercial-led or creative agencies.
Makes sense.
I am curious though, on your end, we talked a little bit about Next. I know we talked about Seltzer. Being that younger demographic, you mentioned you do a lot of creator marketing. What did you find worked and maybe didn't work from that initial push after 10, 15 years of research?
Yeah, so 10 to 15 years of research on the product, I think we found a lot of positive early sign on partnering with folks like Drewski, partnering with folks like Dude with Sign on access to audiences that traditional outlets wouldn't necessarily be able to, and really being able to succinctly package the message of the product in a very authentic way. And we have an amazing team at Anheuser Busch that does a great job vetting creators to make sure that audience metrics line up with where we're trying to go, that the creators' values match up with that specific brand. Again, one of the blessings and a curse of coming from a company that has 300 brands is you really need to spend a lot of time thinking about swim lanes, because not every creator is right for every brand. Not every brand is right for every creator, as you alluded to before. So again, early signs, positive, but still definitely a learning journey that we're on.
I was curious, how did you measure like whether it was successful or not?
Honestly, in the early days, a lot of it came down to we could do pretty in-depth studies on consideration. So for us, it was how do we make sure, especially as we're talking about the first couple of weeks of a launch, which is when the major push was, how do we think about initial brand awareness and then turning that into consideration amongst a demographic where we know how we generally trend with the rest of the Bud Light portfolio, specifically Blue, right? So one of the nice parts about having Blue as a benchmark is it's ubiquitous, right? We're talking about a brand with 98% brand awareness. We're talking about like 98% simple distribution. So it's everywhere, everyone knows about it. So it's a really good way of thinking, what is my benchmark? How do I, you're never going to compete with that from an awareness perspective, but how do I basically expand the Venn diagram of consumers who are looking at both?
Cool. We got to try Next after this. I don't know, how much time do we have left, Nicole? I did want to just ask one last question in terms of the products, just from an inclusivity lens, because I know the products that you do launch are mindful in that sense. And so perhaps let's just spend a minute there and then we'll pass it on to the audience.
Sure. So any specific area that you'd like to hop in?
Well, I think I was curious because I noticed for the Latinx community, there was the Cheladas. For the younger demographic, there was Next. For Seltzer, we're sort of trying to answer that question. So I guess what's next?
Yeah. So one of the, again, benefits and challenges of being the market leader in the beer space, so Bud Light right now is larger than Miller Lite and Coors Light combined, is it does speak to a very broad array of consumers, right? So the product speaks across demographics. The question is, how do we create the right messaging to effectively talk to consumers across demographics, right? It's not just one Super Bowl a year ad that is very sort of 50,000 foot level. It's how do we go in and speak to Hispanic consumers in C-stores in Texas to give them messaging that resonates with them, for them to pick us up and choose us over other considerations in that set, right? And I think what's so interesting, I've spent a lot of time on the road over the last couple of months, is thinking about how much really I've seen the transition over the course of the last 5 years in many of the highest growth markets in the country, right? You think about Texas, you think about Colorado, right? Colorado, I think, was the third biggest share gainer in the last census, and that growth only exploded during the COVID era. What was once considered to be Hispanic marketing is much more transitioning into general market, right? Especially in Texas. I was in Dallas yesterday and this morning, and those lines have completely blurred, which is, I think, really interesting. And I think really kind of shines a light on summits like this when we talk about inclusive marketing. Inclusive marketing is no longer like a nice to have. if you are not inclusive, you will not win in the future. And so it's something we have a lot of really smart folks helping us find ways to attack.
Cool. Thank you, Steve. If everyone needs any Persian creators, you know who to go to.
Do we have any questions?
Yay.
Thank you so much, by the way. What an incredible session. I just have to say, thank you for joining us. So as we think about the future of inclusive marketing, I think this question can be answered by the two of you, but how are you setting up your teams? Because like, if we're not separating Hispanic marketing from just general great marketing, how are you making sure that your teams are prepared to do that?
This is like such a good question. And honestly, I think a question that many large organizations are still wrestling with. And I think it's frankly the combination of organic and inorganic acquisition, right? So one of the things I spend a lot of time when I'm doing recruiting, and I have the privilege of getting to do a lot of recruiting at AB, is my team needs to be very reflective of the US population, right? In a way that's never been more important. And again, that's not a nice to have. That's I cannot win in the future if it doesn't look that way. And to be honest, there's still a lag from where we currently sit as an organization to where we want to be. And so making sure my agency partners, my creative partners on the trade side, on the communication side, on the creator side, can fill in any gaps that I don't have. And that is not a long-term solve. That is a stopgap that we need to solve sooner rather than later. And so it's something we need to do better that we haven't totally nailed, but I know we're very much on the journey.
I love that answer. I think at least at #paid, when we're a lot of brands come in and they know they want a diverse talent across every sort of bucket. But then sometimes you have brands that aren't intentionally not mindful, but they might not be thinking about it. And so almost on every sort of presentation that we have of like, here are the creators that you should go with because of X, Y, Z, we make sure that it's diverse. So that we're sort of pushing that envelope and making sure that brands, I think all brands want to be mindful of it. Some folks might just not be thinking about it at that moment. And sort of it's our job to push that forward.
Really quick, I'd be remiss if I didn't say thank you to brand Innovators and Danone for hosting this today. This has been awesome. It's a really nice change from like me working on one-year plans. So thank you very much for organizing.
Thank you.
Thank you.